whatever, I don't know.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We still have some folks trickling in, joining us. So we've given everyone a few minutes to get on. Other folks may continue to join here. Welcome, everybody, to the webinar we're hosting this morning. My name is Kiley Gosselin. I'm with the Partnership for Strong Communities. We're hosting this in conjunction with our partners and friends at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. This is a really important topic, and we're so excited to see that the conversations around racial justice and racial inequity that have spread across our nation in the last couple of months have also reached here in Connecticut and have opened the conversation about zoning and housing, I think, in ways that the state has never done before, which is a great thing. We wanted today to really share with you an educational background about this topic. So we have over 300 people that have registered, and the webinar will be recorded so that folks will be able to listen to this webinar at any time. Our goal is to really share a history with you about how we've gotten to this place of segregation in Connecticut. Our agenda will then follow to talk a little bit about what that looks like right now. We'll move on to cover some conversation about the role that zoning plays in racial and income segregation, I should say, here in Connecticut. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do. We're going to share some information about what folks can do at the municipal level, what our legislators can do at the state level, and where we might be able to inject funding to assist with these issues moving forward. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the new conversations that have cropped up in this space, as well as some of the work that our partner organizations have been doing for a long time in this space with you today. As I said, I'm Kiley Gosselin. I'm the Executive Director here at the Partnership for Strong Communities. Home Connecticut is our campaign for affordable housing here in the state. It's been in place since 2004. We will also be joined by Erin, Kemple, Executive Director of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and Darby-Hudgens, COO of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and our Policy Director here at the Partnership, Ghio. Finally, I'd just say that this is the first of what we hope will be many conversations and many sessions that we cover in this space. And so we'd ask that you let us know what you would like to hear about in future sessions. You can do that through the chat window that's at the bottom of your screen. You can also do that by emailing us directly. We'll post our contact information at the end of this webinar. We'd really love to hear more about what you would like to see, what you would like to hear about, topics, audiences that you think would be wise to cover or target. Finally, some housekeeping. Please mute yourself. We'll be working to mute folks. Also, we have some technical folks with the partnership here assisting us as well. Want to make sure if you have questions, please put them in the chat window, and we'll hold those questions till the end. So in order to get through the content, We will monitor the chat window throughout this session and help filter those questions and comments, and we'll call them out and try to cover some of those questions at the end of this session today. I think with that, we will get started. I will turn it over to Erin Kemple with the Connecticut Fair Housing Center.
Thank you, Kylie. So we wanted to start by talking about segregation patterns in Connecticut. If any of you saw Jackie Robb Thomas's excellent article this morning in the CT Mirror, she talked about how Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the country. And when you look at this map, you can really understand exactly what that means. So although Connecticut is 71% white, 13% Black, and 9% Latino, what you can see is, in fact, people of color live in just a few areas in Connecticut. In fact, if you were to do the statistics which the center has, the people of color are in just 8% of the total square mileage or square miles of Connecticut. So you can see that in fact there are very strong segregation patterns in Connecticut. Today, what we're going to be talking about, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Darby-Hudgens, right now, to talk about how we got that way, and in fact, how we are reinforcing those statistics and reinforcing that segregation. Finn?
I think Sean is actually going to take it.
Yeah, this is Sean Ghio from the Partnership for Strong Communities. I'm the policy director. I'll go quickly so we can get to that from Finn, but what you're looking at now is a chart. I charted the percentage of a town's population that is white against percent of affordable housing in that town. And you can see there's a clear inverse relationship. If your town has very little affordable housing, it's likely to be very white. And that would be at the lower right-hand side of the chart. And you could see that there's a clear relationship. And conversely, if you have a lot of affordable housing, your town is probably has a more diverse, racially diverse population. Next slide, please. So this is really just looking at what is that, what's another way to look at that. And what you see is, again, charting percent of white population against the percentage of a town's housing stock that's single family. There's just as strong of a relationship. If your town is made up almost entirely of single family homes, then your town is made up almost entirely of white residents. There's a clear connection between single family, land use and zoning, and the racial diversity of towns in Connecticut. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? If your town is mostly single family homes, and most single family homes are owner occupied, they're most likely occupied, more likely occupied by white families. As you can see here, renter households, 42% of renter households are headed by African American or Latino persons, while as Erin mentioned earlier, the percentage of the populations of people of color overall in the state is much lower than that. And owner occupied, you could see the reverse. It's very nearly all white families, disproportionately white households that own their homes. Again, thinking back to the housing stock, single family homes are predominantly owned, and they're predominantly owned by white families in Connecticut. So I'll hand it over to Finn.
Good morning, and thanks again to the partnership for this opportunity. My name is Darby-Hudgens. I work with Erin Kemple at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and my goal today for you is to explain how discriminatory policy and actions built our segregated neighborhoods. As Erin explained, 64% of people of color in Connecticut live in only 8% of our towns, and that was made intentional over about 100 years of decisions. So the next few slides are going to show you how land use policy and zoning help determine how and where we invest resources and where we didn't, and how zoning is linked to dozens of other land use and economic decisions that built and perpetuate residential segregation. A final thought on this before I dive right in is most of my research is Connecticut specific, but many of these actions and their outcomes can be found along the East Coast. So prior to zoning in Connecticut, and again, common in most northeastern cities, development was really spurred by industry, and it was up to factory workers to build housing for their workers, and it was mostly out of need. This is especially evident in Hartford's neighborhoods. In the neighborhood of Parkville, the manufacturers there built over 7,000 units for their employees. However, there are two important things about this type of development that led to both of the decisions we continue to make with municipal zoning code and the segregation found even within our cities. The first one is factory workers of color were often prohibited from living in the housing built by factory owners, and therefore they were forced into small cities or into rural outskirts, small sections of cities or into the rural outskirts outside of the factories where they were forced to live. This early connection to housing and work, the second reason is this early connection to housing and work allowed families to build wealth outside of agriculture. And as rail and transit developed, workers began to want to live farther from their employment, which began the early desire to plan what was previously agricultural land or farmland or traditionally underdeveloped land. So in Connecticut, zoning began in 1927. It was enacted that Connecticut passed the Zoning Enabling Act, which permitted municipalities to develop zoning code to plan their communities. Towns quickly adopted. West Hartford was one of the first to adopt, along with several of the suburbs that surround our urban rings. Pretty much anywhere where you saw sort of a rise of industry between 1900 and 1920, you also saw a municipal zoning code develop in the late 1920s as soon as municipalities were allowed to. And it was immediately established that Connecticut's communities would largely be divided by housing type. So you can see in the text highlighted on this slide, this is text from West Hartford zoning code in the 1920s that determined multifamily housing was going to be excluded from 3/4 of their residential zones as a result of determining it to be uneconomic and suggesting that due to the density and lot size requirements, it wasn't going to be available in most of the residential zones planned for the town of West Hartford. So this is as early as 1927. We were planning our communities by segregating by housing type. So quickly after we started zoning our communities in Connecticut, the country goes through a Great Depression, and we see New Deal policy and legislation that is designed to save our communities from the economic impact of the Great Depression. And what happened as a result of the Great Depression is the federal government for the first time got into the mortgage industry. They knew they would need a plan to save hundreds of homes from foreclosure. But they didn't actually know how to do that. And so as a result of needing to do this, they had to figure out a way to determine how their investments in housing would be safe or secure. And they had never done this before. And so their solution to determining where to protect mortgages from foreclosure and later lend was to go through a process called redlining. You'll see here on this slide a redlined map of the Hartford-West Hartford area. This was developed in 1937 by a subsect of the Federal Housing Authority called the Homeowners Loan neighborhoods. They were non-homogeneous neighborhoods, and therefore they were downgraded. I'm just going to repeat that last thing. I think I had some internet connectivity issues. So Neighborhoods were redlined as a result of them either being non-white neighborhoods, non-homogeneous neighborhoods, meaning they had a diversity of housing types. And as a result of them being downgraded or redlined, they were left out of New Deal economic relief. And redline neighborhoods have yet to recover. One of the phenomena we see in the Hartford area is, for those of you who are familiar with Frog Hollow, most of the Frog Hollow neighborhood was built through actually out the 1920s. And it was built, a diversity of housing was built throughout the 1920s in the Frog Hollow neighborhood. You see single families next to duplexes, and then it was actually redlined just 10 years later. So it had nothing to do with the housing quality stock. Next slide, please. So throughout World War II, we see land use policies continue to segregate our neighborhoods, and many of them were supplemented and reinforced by zoning code. So this first block of text you see up here is an example of how in a single family housing development, they also included what we would know as racially restricted covenants right into the deeds of housing. So the deed, the title of the house said, no person of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants. So what this is saying is we've excluded the neighborhood to exclusively single family housing, and we're gonna make sure that it stays white by putting it right into the deed of the house at non-white families. We know that this practice was outlawed in the 1940s, or this policy was outlawed in the 1940s. However, the practice continued for decades. Throughout World War II, there was also an influx to build more workforce housing, and that was heavily federally subsidized. And that workforce housing was also repeatedly denied to non-white workers. So again, you're seeing sort of a pattern here where our decisions are being made to both segregate our neighborhoods, not only by race, but by specifically housing type. And then we really get to post-World War II development, which for a lot of reasons, really spurred or quickened the pace with which we even further segregated our neighborhoods. So post-World War II America we were on top of the world. There was this tremendous strong sense of nationalism. We could do anything, a strong can-do spirit. And as a result, the federal government poured billions of dollars into the development of communities. They gave money to cities and states to both develop suburbs, to develop housing. They gave money to contractors for subsidized loans. There's tons and tons and tons of federal money was poured into communities for development. And you can see here, on the slide here, you see a typical or traditional, what we know of like a 1950s suburban development that was heavily subsidized. And you also see highway development, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But one of the things about the suburban development that took place was this was another federal inset into the mortgage industry. The GI Bill provided returning soldiers from World War II with an ability to buy housing very inexpensively. This was the first time home ownership was really easily accessed by low and very moderate income families. However, it was not accessible to Black returning soldiers. African Americans struggled to get loans, and banks wouldn't lend to them, and neighborhoods wouldn't often sell to them. Next slide, Chelsea. So as you see, as I just kind of explained 60 years of policy pretty quickly, you'll see how we really developed a perfect storm for what we all know to be urban renewal. So in the throughout 1900 and 1920, we developed workforce housing, and we excluded non-white people from that workforce housing, which means they were forced into smaller, tighter neighborhoods, typically in dense urban cores. Then we redlined the neighborhoods where non-white people lived and removed federal investment from those neighborhoods. Then we see post-World War II development, which was heavily subsidized by federal money and often excluded non-white families from home ownership at a time when there was a great need for housing. Additionally, at the same time of 1950s housing development, we started to build highways for the people who didn't live in cities. As greater dependency became on the car, we needed a way to get in and out of cities. As a result, the neighborhoods where highways were put were the ones we had spent the past 40 years just investing in. So throughout kind of the 1960s and really into today, you see urban renewal projects flooded into urban centers, and were designed, I mean, the goals of urban renewal were public clearance for private investment, and cities and states were given federal funding to quote unquote clean up their slums. That's what they were determined. But as I explained to you on the last slide, we determined where those slums would be and who had been left in them. We had made very deliberate decisions to allow white families mobility and white families access to home ownership, while continuously disinvesting in neighborhoods where we had intentionally locked in families of color. The next slide should really show you the impact of what urban renewal has done. So hold on one second, Chelsea. I did a fair amount of urban renewal research in the city of New London, and I was able to collect oral histories from a gentleman named Mr. Spencer Lancaster, who was the active in the NAACP and was New London's first African-American first selectman. He was a resident of a neighborhood that was lost to urban renewal in New London, and he didn't actually even know how closely linked zoning was. And you'll hear in this quote as he speaks why that matters.
No blacks lived south of Willis Avenue in New London, you know. No blacks.
So as we heard from Mr. Lancaster, everything south of Willits Avenue was saved from urban renewal in the city of New London, and that is a practice that we saw in Bridgeport and in Willimantic and in Norwich and New Haven. White neighborhoods that had been previously zoned for single-family homes were saved from the devastation of urban renewal. And we see perfect examples of this all around. Chelsea, my final slide. And so finally, this is a perfect example of how urban development went wrong, is Hartford's own Constitution Plaza, which was determined by zoning code. We had zoned areas of single family housing. We had zoned West Hartford to allow for investment into suburban home living and suburban home ownership. We had built highways around the neighborhoods where home ownership had been previously redlined or excluded, and we essentially locked out individuals of color from this investment. And as Tom Condren said, the project was supposed to be connected to Main Street by a pedestrian ramp. It was supposed to be housing. It was supposed to generate economic activity in surrounding blocks. But none of that happened. And this was common of urban renewal phenomena across the state and across the country. Neighborhoods of color were essentially leveled by public money with the hope that private investment would follow. It never did, and housing was only ever replaced 1 to 3 of what was lost. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass this on to Erin again.
So one of the things that we're trying to show you is how things got to where we are today, and why that first slide that I showed you, where people of color are crammed in many instances into just a few cities and towns. And as Finn just pointed out, most of that had to do with the government decisions, both federal, state, and local decisions about how money was going to be used, how investment was going to happen, and who people wanted to live in a specific place. But we don't want to let private investment off the hook. So I wanted to talk in the beginning about redlining and how that has resulted in a disinvestment in neighborhoods of color, and also to give you some examples of how zoning has really played out today. So as Finn pointed out, and maybe if you looked at any of the documents that were used in order to redline a particular neighborhood, there was explicit racial language used. So one of the things on the evaluation sheets was what is the percent Negro, what is the percent of foreign born, what is the percent of people who are on public assistance, and if those numbers were high, it was redlined. As a result, today, what we are seeing all the way down to 2020 is that racially diverse and majority non-white census tracts receive fewer mortgages than white census tracts, even when you're controlling for income. And what this means is that people of color are really not able to break out of that redlining that happened back in 1937 and move into areas that are either racially diverse or into majority white census tracts. In addition to that, one of the things that we have found in looking at some of the statistics with regards to lending is that low-income African Americans or Latinos are denied mortgages at twice the rate of whites in Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven, and at 2.4 the rates of whites in Torrington. So that's low income, meaning people making less than $70,000, are still denied mortgages at twice the rate of whites, even when you control for income. And in addition to that, middle income African Americans, Latinos are denied mortgages at twice the rate of people who are white. And so we are also starting to look at, even when people of color are able to get mortgages, what kind of mortgages are they able to get? And one of the things that we have found is that people of color generally pay more for their mortgages than people who are white. So they're not just being denied mortgages, but even when people of color are able to get mortgages, they're paying more in closing costs, they're paying more in other costs and fees, which again puts a high economic hurdle in front of people who want to buy. The Connecticut Fair Housing Center did fair housing testing in 2016 and 2017. And what we did is we sent people who were African American or Latino into banks and bank branches to inquire about getting a mortgage. People of color were treated less favorably than whites when matched for income, credit score, et cetera. And people were treated less favorably than whites in 53% of the tests. In one particular test, to give you an example of how people were treated less favorably, the African American tester was told her student loans were a huge problem, while the white tester was not told this, even though the white tester owed more in her student loans. So again, one of the things that happens, especially in the beginning when someone is looking for a mortgage, they are looking for coaching, they're looking for information, and the coaching being offered to African Americans and Latinos is much different than the coaching that is being offered to whites. Even just getting information about how a company or a bank does mortgages is difficult. As you can see from the last bullet, a Latina tester was told that the branch she went into did not do mortgages, while the white tester was given written information and also was able to meet with the loan officer. Redlining is not the only thing that is continuing to impact the way that that people of color are able to access housing. In general, what zoning is supposed to do is to set standards for location of industry in residential neighborhoods, preserve wetlands, regulation of traffic. Unfortunately, what we see is that some legitimate concerns that we don't, for instance, want a coal burning plant next to a housing complex, some of those concerns are being exaggerated or increased in order to keep out affordable housing. Remember, as Finn said during her presentation, the state has the power to regulate zoning, but it has given this power to municipalities. It didn't have to do that. It could have kept the zoning on a statewide basis, but instead municipalities through home rule are allowed to make decisions about how zoning is going to look, who can move into their town, what types of housing tenure are allowed in their town. And as you'll see, as I go through the next couple of slides, those are being used in particular to keep some communities nearly all white. So to give you a sense of how zoning creates exclusion. What you have in front of you is a comparison. On the left, what you see is that there is a low minimum lot size. Lot size in particular is used to control the type of housing and the number of housing units. So if there's a minimum lot size of, for instance, 1/4 of an acre, it's going to cost a lot less to create housing, and the housing that is created will be much less expensive. If you look at the picture on the right, which shows a high minimum lot size. One of the things in Jackie Robb Thomas's article today is it showed that some of the suburbs of New Haven has as much as a 3-acre zoning requirement per unit. And that's going to result in a much more expensive house, as well as keeping out any kind of affordable housing or housing that would be affordable to more people. So minimum lot size is one of the major things that is being used to keep affordable housing, or housing that is affordable, out of communities. The second is housing type. It limits where housing, multifamily housing may be built. So again, on the left, what you'll see is that multifamily housing has a lower cost per unit and can be used in order to allow people who could not afford, for instance, a single family house like the one on the right, that is one unit on, for instance, an acre. And so by keeping the housing costs high, you can limit who can actually afford to buy in your community. So one of the things that I know has been talked about is, well, if you know, the only color I care about is green. In other words, we are not trying to discriminate. We just want people with money. That is not something that actually results in integration if the only color you think about is green. Since, as we've seen from the last 2 slides, by the type of housing and by the lot size, we can control who can afford what color green, and who can afford to move in, and that in and of itself is going to create segregation. So to just summarize some of the issues that have prevented affordable housing, what we can see, next slide, Chelsea, is that 57.4% of municipalities do not include provisions for affordable housing. And what that means is that in order to build affordable housing in 57% of our municipalities, you have to go through an appeals process. In order, it is not, you cannot build something as of right. It is instead, you have to go through an appeals process. And of the municipalities that do include provisions, so of the 43% of municipalities that do include provisions for affordable housing, 95% also require a special permit. Well, what's the big deal? Why is a special permit so difficult? It takes time. So you acquire land, and then you cannot build on it. You can't do anything with it until you go through the special permit appeals process. And if any of you have been involved in the special permit appeals process, it takes a long time. It also is open to public comment. And we often see people coming out and saying things like, we don't want that type of housing here because it's going to change the character of the neighborhood. 25 municipalities have no provision for the construction of multifamily housing. So that in and of itself is going to prevent the least expensive type of housing, as you saw from the earlier slides. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with, as of 2013, and we are working on trying to update some of these statistics, but it hasn't changed much. So the percentage of zones permitting single-family homes, 84.2% of residential zones in Connecticut permit single-family housing. So if you wanted to build single-family housing, pretty much you can do it almost anywhere you want. Two-family housing, 49.1% of residential zones. That means it's going to be a lot harder to do two-family housing and multifamily housing. You can see that those percentages are about the same. What if you wanted to put two-family housing or multifamily housing in a single-family housing zone? A, would probably be turned down. And you would then again have to go through the appeals process, which is, as I explained, expensive and time consuming, and allows the public to come in and make comments and to oppose it. And a lot of people, and I've heard this from many town representatives, council people, people on the town council saying, if I approve this housing, I will not be reelected. Well, you'd think that that applied to all types of housing. You know, we don't want any multifamily housing in our communities. In fact, 33.4% of residential zones in Connecticut permit elderly housing, meaning housing for people who are either 55 and older or people who are 62 and over. So a pretty high percentage of zones, residential zones, do allow elderly housing. But then we get to affordable housing, and you can see that only 15.5%. And so elderly housing and affordable housing should be very similar, because elderly housing is not housing at the highest level. You're not building single family homes on 3 acres. You're not building a 2-family home on 2 acres. It's usually multifamily housing, and it usually has at least 10 to 15 units at the very least. So you would think that affordable housing, elderly housing, multifamily housing, 2-family housing would all have similar percentages of zoning use, but in fact they do not. Next slide. So one of the things, let me just say one other thing about elderly housing. One of the things that has happened over the years is that a lot of towns, to try and increase the amount of affordable housing, have built elderly housing. And by building elderly housing, as I said before, it's restricted to people who are 55 and older or people who are 62 and older. Sometimes it allows people who are young and disabled, but not always. And it's not a surprise to me that so many towns are trying to meet their affordable housing obligations by approving elderly housing. Because if you look at the statistics on age, and Connecticut is the 7th oldest state in the country, 86% of people over the age of 65 are white. So if you're going to put in elderly housing in a town that is majority white, you're not really going to change the character of the neighborhood if by character what you mean is race. So you're going to build that elderly housing, it's going to be affordable housing, but the people who are going to qualify for that housing will look just like the people in the town if the town is majority white. But moving on to restrictive zoning. Lot sizes, we need to have a standard for lot sizes to ensure it's big enough for the housing. That's the reason that we have restrictive lot sizes. But in fact, some towns have used lot sizes to restrict affordable housing, and on average, single family homes must have 0.52 or half an acre, while affordable housing must have 2.68 acres and multifamily housing must have 1.87 acres. Again, the more acres that you have, the more it's going to cost. I just saw one comment that the reason to put in elderly housing is because it will not overburden the schools. But if anybody saw Jackie Robb Thomas's article today, in the town of Weston, the school enrollment has dropped 9% and is expected to continue dropping. And that's not unusual for some of the majority white communities that we're seeing in Connecticut. As Connecticut's population ages, again, we're the 7th oldest state in the country, the number of kids who are enrolled in schools is continuing to drop. And so many of the towns that have prided themselves on having high quality schools are losing their population and may need to build some housing in order for families to be able to move in. Just a little side note there. Go ahead, Chelsea. Other zoning regulations that have been inflated to exclude development. In a review of all of the 830G decisions that have been made either in the Superior Court or in the appeals courts, is watershed and wetlands designations have been used often to exclude development. And so where there wasn't a watershed or wetlands designation, somebody comes in, they apply to build affordable housing. Now, all of a sudden, those affordable housing can't be put in because of watershed and wetlands designations. Parking is something that we see. A lot of affordable housing is rejected because it's going to increase it's not big enough to meet all of the parking restrictions, and this is especially true down in Fairfield County, where parking may not be as big an issue because of the extensive public transportation, especially into the city. In rural areas, sewer and septic systems have been used as an excuse. So one of the things that has been really examined and looked at by planners and people who do housing development is whether or not our sewer and septic system really need the amount of capacity that towns are requiring. Another issue is open space, and while open space is excellent and important for all communities, often what we'll see is a town that has lots of open space, a high percentage of open space denying affordable housing because of open space, while at the same time deciding to put in single-family homes or other kinds of economic development. Public safety is something that we often hear. There was recently an article where somebody said at a public hearing, if we put in affordable housing, there's going to be a lot of people partying for Cinco de Mayo, and we don't necessarily have the police force to address that. Occupancy restrictions we've already talked about, and special permitting. Oh, actually, let me talk about occupancy restrictions. One of the things that has come up often in the recent years, and in Branford and in Guilford, they recently approved the creation of new affordable housing. But in one of the towns, they said they chose the developer specifically because the developer has a reputation, for not advertising outside of the town in which the housing is located, which is both a violation of state law, but also results in reinforcing segregation. Down in Old Saybrook, a new complex, affordable housing complex was put in a couple of years ago, and the town asked permission to restrict occupancy to only people who currently lived in the town. Since Old Saybrook is majority white, that would have also reinforced segregation. And finally, a lot of the special permitting that I talked about is being used to exclude development of affordable housing. And now I'm going to turn it over to the partnership to talk about how we can address some of the issues that have been raised in the beginning of our work here today.
Thanks, Erin. This is Sean Ghio again, Policy Director at Partnership for Strong Communities. I'm going to look at what we're going to begin talking about what we can do, but also quickly look back at what we have done or what we've tried to do. So first, the state of Connecticut has tried to address this issue of segregated living that we live in Connecticut, and it did it many years ago. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about this because it is such a contentious issue in the state, and it's really not the it's not the end of the conversation. Really, this is the beginning. And what I'm talking about is the Affordable Housing Appeals Act, which is commonly called Section 830G. It was enacted 30 years ago this Wednesday, in July 1990. And what it is what's called a builder's remedy. But it allows developers, if they present affordable multifamily housing development that sets aside a certain percentage of units as affordable, to be built in a manner that, unless it infringes on health and safety needs, to be built. And if the town denies that application, the developer can appeal it. And that law has produced more than 5,000 units, and it's has resulted in more than 5,000 housing units in 30 years. The appeals, there have been about 180 court decisions, towns denied applications and that were appealed by the developer. And about 75% of the time, developers prevail. So that's 830G. It's been used more. There's many communities in Connecticut that have seen no 830G developments, and there's others that have seen quite a few. So it's not a complete solution to the problems of concentration of affordable housing that we've been talking about. Thank you. So the state legislature and the governor at the time took another pass at trying to deal with this back in the mid-2000s by passing something called the incentive housing zoning. And it encourages towns to increase their supply of mixed income housing at slightly higher densities than what already exists. So this is state law. It's been law for since I believe 2007 it was enacted, and it actually provides incentive payments to municipalities that create these incentive housing zones, both for creating the zones and then if multifamily housing is actually built within those zones. And to date, 11 towns have adopted approved incentive housing zones. And what that means is those are zones that meet the specific criteria of the legislation that have been reviewed and approved by Connecticut's Department of Housing. So those communities are eligible for the incentive payments from the state. Now, there are many other communities that have, through their own decisions, their own processes, they've passed zoning ordinances that allow they have zones that are very much like incentive housing zoning districts. They don't meet the specific criteria of the law, so those districts are not eligible for the incentive payments, but they do meet the spirit of incentive housing zones in the sense that they allow for the creation of mixed income housing at slightly higher densities than you might see in the rest of the town. So those are really the two big efforts that the state has taken to date, 830G and incentive housing zones. So in 2017, there were some changes enacted to Section 830G. And within those changes, there was also language that required all municipalities to create an affordable housing plan and then update it every 5 years. So those housing plans affordable housing plans are due, the first ones to be submitted. They all need to be submitted to the state by July 2022. So unfortunately, the language in the statute doesn't really provide any guidance around what an affordable housing plan is or should include. And the state, through the Department of Housing, is working through Regional Plan Association and the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity Partners, of which Partnership with Strong Communities is one, to help create a guidebook for municipalities to help understand what a good affordable housing plan looks like and what should be included and what is a good process, an inclusive process to engage folks in your community in affordable housing planning development. There are, now having said there's no guidance does not mean there aren't good examples of plans in the state. There are. both from large cities to rural towns to suburbs and everything in between. A lot of towns have already taken it in many years prior to this being required to take and develop very good affordable housing plans. Those are the kind of things that where the work of the Regional Plan Association and the guidebook will use as templates for municipalities to try to show really how you can get this done and get it done in a way that works for your community. So that's what we've done. Now, what have we been trying to do? So the first is for 2 years now, there's been legislation looking to modify the zoning enabling statute, section 8-2 as it's called. Now, this last iteration for this past legislative session, the 2020 session, which was abbreviated, unfortunately, it's called HB 5132. It requires, again, the affordable housing planning requirement, but it also makes a couple critical changes, but modest changes, I think, to the zoning enabling statute. One is that it reiterates that municipalities already have the obligation to affirmatively further the purposes of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And second, it eliminates a requirement that regulations be made with reasonable consideration as to the character of a district. Now that I think there's a lot of varying views on that. My view around the reasonable consideration of the character of a district is character, unlike other aspects of what can be reasonably under the review of local zoning authorities, character is not defined in the statute. So if it's not defined, what does it mean? So my suggestion is, if you don't want to eliminate it, let's define it. And I think it's already defined largely by what the statute already allows, which is what is the character of the community. It has to do with lots, has to do with density, it has to do with setbacks, it has to do with all those things that make up the physical space of our towns that are controlled by local zoning. Character, then what remains for character? I think that's a question. So HB 5132 was working its way again through the Planning and Development Committee. But of course, as we all know, because of COVID, we've had to have this abbreviated session. So that's where that bill stands now. And the next slide. There was also a bill this year to require Planning and Zoning Commissioner training, HB 5303. Connecticut doesn't offer a training curriculum right now, and it doesn't require training for commissioners. It does require some training for its inland wetlands commissioners, and it provides that training. Commissioner training is not uncommon. In fact, you see it in many states that you might not expect to see it in, including many southern and western communities, where you might think the perceptions of government control, overreach, controlling things from outside a local area might not be what the culture dictates, but in fact that's the way they are. It's very common. It's the expectation that if you're going to rule on land use decisions that impact your community long past your lifespan, most likely, that you might require some very minimal training to understand the law, which is very complex. So we proposed that in 2020, and we think it's a very reasonable, very modest requirement. And again, because of the abbreviated session, that's where it stands. So I'll hand it off to Kiley.
Hi, everyone. I just want to add too that 2 years ago, the partnership proposed in their legislative agenda an item that would create a state fund for municipalities to draw on for a variety of costs that may arise with multifamily housing. One of the arguments against putting affordable housing or multifamily housing in a town that we often hear is that the infrastructure is not in place. We don't have sewers. It would require additional sidewalks and roadway installments, and the town can't support that and the developers can't support that, so therefore we can't do it. So one other option that we can talk more about too is that the state could do is to try to set aside some funding to help combat that and provide those critical infrastructure resources in places that would be welcoming of affordable housing, so that those don't continue to be hurdles. So what I'm going to walk you through are some different options that both municipalities and our state legislature have for combating this. There's obviously a lot more out there. There's a big universe of ideas, and more of those are being discussed right now. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about Desegregate CT, and many of you are familiar with Open Communities Alliance and some other groups that have been working on this for a while. But we wanted to share with you at least a smattering of ideas that you could start with now, that you can encourage your legislators to do. We'll be doing the same thing here at the partnership and with our home Connecticut partners over the coming year, looking at the legislation we've already proposed, looking at additional steps that we can take, language that we can continue to push with our partners. So I will go through a couple of these, but again, these slides are available for your use after this session, so I won't go into detail on all of these. At the municipal level, there's a lot that you can do just at a fundamental level, and the partnership will be putting out a one-pager soon that towns, anybody can use in their town that says, hey, my town's not diverse. What role does zoning play in that? What are the steps I can take right now to sort of help move this along? I'm interested in this movement. I'm interested in diversifying my town. One thing you can do is review your town's housing data profile. The partnership every 2 years has produced an individual profile for each town. I know Fair Housing has additional research in this space. The profiles that we put out include race information, as well as housing cost and income. It's a whole smattering of really useful data that everyone can look at. We'll be updating those again this year. And in fact, we're working on putting it in an online, more interactive format. But right now, the 2018 versions are still available for your use on our website. And I've put a link to those in the chat function as well, and you can access them on the partnership's website. Something else you can do is just review your town's ordinance for some of the exclusionary elements that we've talked about today, minimum floor requirements, the parking requirements that Erin discussed, permitting requirements. You can also conduct a housing needs assessment for your town. For those of you who aren't familiar, there's a program called Sustainable Connecticut, which has some different points and rating systems that towns can get based on their sustainability. And that sustainability is measured including housing elements. One of the sort of basic housing elements that you can do at a fundamental level is review your housing data profile for your town and hold a public meeting about that, as well as conduct a housing needs assessment. And I encourage towns to look at not just the housing needs assessment of folks within their immediate town, but to look regionally as well. I think there's a question about demonstrating need as a way to combat NIMBY in the chat window. And one way to do that is to really look beyond the immediate borders of your town. Look at the region. What are the housing costs? We know that 120,000+ households in Connecticut pay more than 50% of their income towards housing costs. The need for affordable housing is very high. You can look at the affordable housing plan legislation that Sean talked about. Find out whether your town's put together an affordable housing plan. If not, encourage them to do that. And again, look at different zoning ordinances that can be modified. And we'll talk in a moment about how some of those can be taken up at the legislative level. But a lot of the zoning changes we talked about today could very well happen at the local level if enough residents are interested in making those changes and taking those steps forward. Next slide, please. So we'll go through a couple slides of legislative actions. We talked about the changes, or I'm sorry, we talked about 8-2. Sean talked about House Bill 5132. You'll see on that, just passing the legislation that Sean mentioned would be a really first, arguably basic step in taking out the element that allows towns to oppose affordable housing based on the character of the community element. That bill, as Sean mentioned, got truncated with the last session being shortened. However, the session before it made it all the way to the last night of session. It made it through the House, but not the Senate. So there's a possibility there of, I think, pushing that or even strengthening it this year. There's other bills that have been proposed by the partnership or by our partners. Expanding housing authority jurisdiction is one, allowing some of our housing authorities to develop in areas outside of the boundaries of their town is one way that we can work to expand affordable housing elsewhere. Requiring the land use board and commissioner training Sean mentioned. Other topics that have been discussed include eliminating municipal zoning approval entirely for affordable housing projects, as well as making some state changes in the space of zoning requirements. For example, requiring mixed use and mid-rise zoning around transit. Next slide, please. Go through some funding actions here. Dedicating state funds for infrastructure investments to support increased housing density is one. Again, increasing funding for rehabilitation and construction of affordable housing is key. And I think in a lot of ways, the way we funded affordable housing has led to really one type of affordable housing, or a primary type of affordable housing, which is this higher density number of units, whether it's through the low-income housing tax credit program or similar. I think there's a need to look at alternative sources and types of ways to fund affordable housing that may include shorter term deed restrictions or funding rehabilitation for small multifamily. We know that all towns but one have small multifamily stock within their town already, and simply rehabbing that or constructing similar type housing in the same area can be another way to help increase our multifamily housing stock in areas outside of our urban centers. Increasing housing voucher funding to the extent we're able to create more rental housing in areas outside of our urban centers, folks can then take those vouchers and use them elsewhere. Right now, folks are thwarted in using vouchers by funding limitations, rent limitation calculations, but also just in the fact that there's not a lot of rental stock in some areas outside of our city. So even using that voucher becomes much more difficult simply outside of an area, because they're outside of the urban center, because there's no rental housing with which to use your voucher for. Expanding funding for fair housing enforcement to deal with some of the discrimination issues that tend to crop up. Vouchers is one area where we see a lot of that. And finally, funding legal services to help deal with eviction prevention to keep folks housed is another avenue. Next slide. So I think this is the end of our presentation. We wanted to talk, well, I guess there's one more slide after this, Chelsea, so if you want to move forward. There's a lot of new conversation happening in this space right now, which is great to see. Erin Kemple mentioned the new article that Jackie Robb Thomas put out this morning, which really kind of does a great job of illustrating a lot of the concepts we're talking about here today. Her other series, Segregated by Design, is something I'd encourage you to read if you haven't already. It really provides some insight into what's happening in some of our towns where we've been pushing back against this for so long. The Connecticut Democrats put out a Juneteenth agenda, which included some housing actions that is definitely worth looking at, and hopefully a roadmap for changes that the legislature can take moving forward. Sarah Bronin has been working on this as well. Many of you know Sarah is a professor of land use at UConn Law and has been working on an effort called Desegregate Connecticut. You can see the link here. Has some great data and resources available, particularly around the zoning issues. We highlighted some of the CT Mirror work. There's been a lot of media, which you can see at the bottom of your screen here, at the bottom of this slide, in this space that I think is great food for thought and good reading, but also great to share with folks, especially if you're at the municipal level, or share with your legislature to help move the conversation along. Next slide. So now we have some time left, thankfully, to go through some Q&A. I have seen some questions pop up in the chat window throughout the session, and I know some of those have been answered by the speakers in the chat window as we've moved along. But I'm going to go back through and highlight either the questions that were answered or maybe some of those that were for the broader audience. If you have questions that you haven't asked yet, now's a great time to put them in the chat window, and we'll try to go through those. So There was a question early on that I wanted to go back and ask Finn to cover, and I know she did a little bit in the chat window here about redlining and who instituted redlining. What was the government agency or entity, Finn, that brought about redlining?
Thanks, Kylie. So I put a couple links in the chat, but I'm happy to answer that in greater detail. So in the 30s, the federal government developed an authority called the Federal Housing Authority, or the FHA. Underneath the FHA, they created an organization called the Homeowners Loan Corp, commonly known as HOLC. And those two entities wrote a guidebook specifically on how to grade or rank neighborhoods to determine the value or risk of investment. And in that guidebook was very specific instructions that neighborhoods that had non-white residents or neighborhoods that had a diversity of housing should be downgraded. Also in that instructions of downgraded or how to downgrade neighborhoods was anybody who received any sort of relief or welfare relief or subsidy relief. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Finn. There's a question about a couple questions about funding for the IHC program. It's my understanding that there is still funding for the IHC program available at the state level, but Sean, I didn't know if you wanted to chime in just to confirm that.
That's my understanding as well. I think we can follow up with the Department of Housing exactly who ministers that program to see exactly where the resources are and make sure that we include that information in the presentation notes.
Yes, it's my understanding there's still, at last check, a couple million at least set aside for that, but we can confirm that. Question from Danielle Chapman about any tips on determining who is making these decisions in a particular town. Does every town have a planning and zoning commissioner? And are there other particular jobs roles that hold that control? What role do the local real estate agencies play also? Great question, Danielle. I'm going to toss this to Sean, and maybe Erin wants to add in as well. And I'd add that every town is different. And as Sarah noted in the, Sarah Bronin noted in the chat window, not every town even has sort of structured zoning set up. But Sean, why don't you jump in?
Sure. Yeah, as Sarah mentioned in the chat, I believe every community other than 2 in the state have local zoning, which means they have a local zoning authority. And in most states, it's a planning zoning commission. There are some communities that have a joint, their town council or perhaps a board of selectmen may serve that role. I suggested the simplest thing to do and the most direct thing to do for most is to contact their first selectman or mayor's office to get the answer to that question. And as far as realtors and their role in this, I think we should pass to Erin or Finn.
So realtors, and let me be clear, real estate agents, realtors are people who are members of the National Board of Realtors, or the Connecticut Board of Realtors doesn't include all real estate agents. Real estate agents really do play a part in this. I think one of the themes of today's training has been is that it's not one or the other. It's a public-private partnership that has gotten us where we are today. We have done extensive fair housing testing in home sales, and one of the things we find over and over and over again is steering by real estate agents. Steering means that we send in someone who's African American or Latino, someone who's white, into a real estate agency. We tell them to ask for similar types of housing, such as a 3-bedroom with an attached garage or something along those lines. And in those instances, in the majority of our testing, people who are African American or Latino are steered toward neighborhoods that are African American or Latino, and people who are white are steered toward neighborhoods who are white. A particularly stark example of this occurred in Fairfield County a couple of years ago, where we sent in 20 testers to real estate agencies in the city of Fairfield. The African American Latino testers were pre-qualified for a mortgage of about $350,000. The white testers were pre-qualified for a mortgage of about $325,000. African American testers had more than 5 years on the job, a good credit score, and had saved a 20% down payment. White testers did not have any of those. 17 of the African American testers were told you can't really afford to buy in the city of Fairfield. You really should be looking in insert neighborhood in Bridgeport here. And the white testers were not only shown houses in the city of Fairfield, but were also, at least one tester was told, well, I know you're pre-qualified for a $325,000 mortgage, but let's look at some houses that are more expensive than that. So there's definitely a public-private partnership that is creating this segregation that we see today. And also, let me just say one other thing on that topic with regards to the role played by cities and towns. One of the other things that we have really not talked about, the segregation we've been talking about is really race and national origin segregation. There are significant amounts of segregation and housing discrimination experienced by people with disabilities. In particular, we've been trying to determine if cities and towns know and understand their own zoning ordinances when it comes to people living together who have who are disabled, with or without, for the most part, what we're looking for is if we just walk in and say we want to buy a 4-bedroom house for 4 disabled people to live together and not have it be a staffed group home, what will happen? And so far, only one town has said, yes, that is not a problem in our community. You can do that. Of the other 15 that we've done, the majority of times the zoning officer, so not the zoning board of appeals, just somebody who is appointed by the city to actually answer questions like this, says, yeah, no, that's not allowed in our community. No more than X number of unrelated people, and you can't do that, essentially is the answer that everybody's being given.
Thanks. I wanted to comment too, there was a question about sort of pulling folks together to determine what are the top 2 or 3 avenues that affordable housing advocates could take in this space, as opposed to having a broad range of ideas. And so that's exactly the reason that Home Connecticut exists. And we do have an advisory group made up of folks from national home builders, planners, CCM, Fair Housing Center, affordable housing advocates and the like, that put together a consensus agenda. So they come together, and the agenda that we had last year, which included the 8-2 changes, as Sean mentioned, as well as planning and zoning training and some funding requests, was that agenda. So if you're interested, we're actually engaging in a strategic planning process for Home Connecticut. Just shoot us an email on our website, myself, Sean, or anybody else in our organization, and we'll be happy to connect you to that process. There were a good number of questions here about NIMBYism and actions towns may be taking, for example, to currently take down some of the smaller quarter-acre lot homes and combining lots to build bigger homes, and what folks at the local level can do to sort of combat actions like that, or to combat the conversation I was reading in the comments, to combat NIMBYism generally in towns, to explain the need for affordable housing in places where that conversation may not have happened or happened in a robust way. I'll open it up to the panel, anyone to jump in on that one. I don't know, maybe Finn or Sean wants to speak to that.
Go ahead, Sean.
Kylie, can you just restate the question one more time?
The question was about what folks can do to combat NIMBYism, particularly either generally the conversation about affordable housing and the need for affordable housing being new to some folks, or also combating particular activities like combining of lots to create larger lots and larger homes. What can folks at the local level do or should do to engage in a process to work on that?
I'll first about NIMBYism. I think one of the things that this session in the chat questions has reinforced in me that we should continue to talk more about what we call the myths of housing and the myths of affordable housing. And because there is a lot of misinformation about the impacts of denser housing choices in your communities. We've heard a bunch of them already today. So I think in terms of attracting school children, I saw a question about the environmental costs of multifamily housing. So I think one thing is to educate yourselves, and you can do some of that at our website at pschousing.org around what's really the facts around housing. And the other most critical thing is to actually show up at planning and zoning commission hearings, or if there's a housing proposal in your community and you've learned about it and you feel strongly about it, is to show up, because as a former local planner, I can tell you planning commissioners listen to constituents that are standing in front of them, or in this case, often their images are shown on video conferencing, that have opinions on these developments. And they are often only hearing from those that really feel strongly against things. So educate yourself and show up. Those are really the two things that I would point to. And in terms of tear downs, which I think tear downs, so the redevelopment of a previously developed lot from a more modest home, often most likely single family home, to a much larger single family home. I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I think there's some people on this call that I know have good answers for that, because they are land use professors, land use attorneys, and probably have some really good ideas about that. And I think that is something that I've seen in other communities, Cape Cod, vacation destinations, certainly along the Connecticut shoreline, and Fairfield County in particular. It's a real issue. And obviously those homes, when they're torn down, become in one sense less affordable in the future because of their the larger footprint that they occupy.
I just want to add a couple of things. I want to give a shout out to the town of Scotland. A couple of years ago had a group home that wanted to move in and heard that there was going to be massive amounts of opposition to that. And what they did at the beginning of the hearing is say, here's what the fair housing laws say. The fair housing laws say that we must give people with disabilities a pass on some of our regulations. It's actually called a reasonable accommodation. And some of that reasonable accommodation may be that more unrelated people can live together than is currently in our regulations. So understand that that's where we are coming from. That's where we're going to be starting this conversation. And as a result of the zoning board of appeals opening statement, I think that the group home got a much fairer hearing than before. And so a very easy thing to do here is to ask the zoning board of appeals to talk about the fair housing laws and talk about the fact that refusing to put in affordable housing means that we're refusing to allow a diversity of people to access our community. And by diverse, we mean diverse both in terms of race, national origin, families, people with disabilities, and different income levels, all of which may violate the fair housing laws.
I want to add one other thing around local applications, local planning, zoning commissioners. I think a lot of local communities could be doing more, local governments could be doing more to attract and notify folks of development activity and what's on the agendas of these planning and zoning commissioners. And there are towns that do a great job, but there are also towns, and not surprisingly perhaps, their websites are very out of date. It's very challenging to find information. In fact, in my own community, there is a proposal for multifamily housing development that is likely to be very controversial. And it's been on the Planning and Zoning Commission's agenda for a while. Even though I do this for a living, just found out about it. I think that there's a lot more that local towns, if local towns are going to have control over their land use, they need to reach out to their residents to make sure they're informed. And I think a lot more can be done.
Thanks, Sean. Good question from Ross Burkhart. We touched on this, but didn't go into depth on it, on the role that building codes play in affordable housing development or just construction in general. I don't know, Sean, if you want to jump in on that. Particularly, Ross is asking if there's any research going on about the role that building codes play in driving up costs of construction.
You're giving me the hard questions. I don't know research. I think that is, we can look into that and talk to some of our friends. You mentioned the home builders earlier, Kiley and others. I think we can find out exactly the role that building codes do play in that. So I can't really speak to that right now.
Yeah. Hold on one second. Someone was asking ADUs, addressing that's accessory dwelling units in a bit more detail. Sean, I'll toss that one to you as well. But the role that ADUs can play in diversifying a town and diversifying housing stock.
Sure. ADUs, accessory dwelling units, in-law apartments, granny flats. You can call them a lot of things. I think they're widely seen by a lot of advocates as low-hanging fruit in this conversation, particularly in New England, where they're pre-zoning traditional form of land use. When you talk about character of a community, they are part of a traditional New England form of development, backyard cottages, building onto smaller, modest homes for boarders, for relatives. These are all things that fit into the vernacular architecture of Connecticut and should be really a no-brainer for Connecticut municipalities to deal with. And I think with a problem, and a lot of towns have allow accessory dwelling units in some form. I think where it becomes a problem is where there's too many conditions placed on how an ADU can be developed. And what I mean by that is restrictions on who can occupy it, restrictions on its relationship relative to the home, the main home, restrictions on unnecessary restrictions that require parking that make it impossible to develop an accessory dwelling unit on a lot of lots in your community. So there's a lot of great examples nationwide. This is something that's happening in quite a lot of communities across the country. Portland, Oregon is a great example. They changed their zoning to be more permissive to accessory dwelling units, and it didn't really work. And then they realized it was because they were still being too restrictive in their manner. So they opened it up some more, and now you can see some really great examples of accessory dwelling units that have been built in Portland, Oregon that completely fit their neighborhoods, that don't overwhelm their neighborhoods.
Thanks, Sean. A question that we talked about a little bit before Erin did, but are there any other towns that you would highlight that are doing great work in the affordable housing development space, maybe unsung heroes or sort of rock star towns, someone put in their question, that have taken positive steps as we're discussing here today in the last few years? Erin, if you have any others to add, Finn or Sean.
Let me just say that when I shouted out Scotland, the town of Scotland, I was only talking with regards to disability. I don't know anything about their affordable housing development, so I can't really say that. And unfortunately, I don't know of any rock star towns, because even the towns that are agreeing to put in affordable housing are mostly agreeing to put in affordable housing for people who are elderly, or expanding the housing for people who are elderly. And this really doesn't get at the affordable housing issues for the vast majority of people in Connecticut, and also results a lot of times in people not diversifying the town in terms of race and national origin, because as I said, 86% of the people over the age of 65 are white.
I'll take that, take a stab. I think maybe I'll limit my response to towns. I think they're doing a great job around planning, and there's several, but the ones that quickly came to mind. One is a very small town, Salisbury, which really has a really great and thoughtful affordable housing plan, very specific around how to expand the amount of the diversity and amount of housing in their town, and where to do it. And it was, and the process they used was very inclusive of involving the whole town. So I would look to them. Bethel has done a lot of great planning around affordable housing and changed some of its zoning as a result. So has Ridgefield. And Fairfield, I think, is a real leader in its thinking and its planning around housing. Now, that's planning. Now, and I think the disconnect, or the thing we have to remember, is all the good planning in the world, we still have to have planning decisions made by planning and zoning commissioners. So we need to think separately from what's good planning and then what's good decision making when an application sits in front of a commission.
Thanks, Sean. Well, we're just about at the end of our session here. Just taking a look to see if we have any other questions. And I think that's it. Someone mentioned POCDs, or towns. Towns have what are called POCDs, or plan. It's basically a plan of conservation and development is what it stands for. And towns generally put those together every 10 years. And so that's another place, if you're looking for some ways you can get started at the municipal level. And in addition to reviewing your town zoning code to look for some of the issues we talked about here today, looking at that POCD, it's kind of a forward-looking plan from a town on sort of how they want to develop and where they might want to develop, is a great place to start getting an understanding sort of in advance for where your town might be going in terms of thinking about development and how you might want to influence that process. And then finally, I just mentioned, I think there was one comment in there about the fact that we have all white presenters today. And I just wanted to acknowledge that it is something that we discussed in putting this webinar together. Obviously, we welcome folks of all races to participate in any session we're doing. However, we also felt like it isn't the job of people of color to explain the sort of racism and segregation that exists in our state and how we got here, that this was a system that was set up by white dominant culture and white people. And we also felt it was important that we're responsible in many ways for working together to help dismantle that. So I just wanted to share that. I don't know if any of our other presenters wanted to comment on that as well, but I didn't want it to go, unnoticed and not acknowledged. With that, I just want to say thank you to everybody for participating. I'd like to thank especially our friends at the Fair Housing Center, Finn and Erin. I also want to give a shout out to Chelsea Ross with the partnership, Don Branson and Charlie Shaddix, who've been helping us behind the scenes. We will, again, this is a recorded session, so we'll be sharing it. You can be able to access it on our website. I believe it's also going to be broadcast on CTN. And if you have further questions, as well as topics you'd like us to see cover in future sessions, please just send us an email. Our contact information is up here on the screen. You can also access all of the speakers here today via our websites for our own organizations, where we have lots of information. And again, thanks folks for sharing links in the chat as well. We'll do our best to package those together and put them in a central location for everybody to access. So with that, I just say thank you. We look forward to talking again soon. Please reach out. This is the beginning of a conversation that we hope goes a long way. We look forward to a productive legislative session, I hope, this year, and lots more conversation. Thanks, everyone.